The first hint that my world was about to unravel came from an unexpected phone call from Mrs. Parker, my elderly neighbor. Her voice wavered with urgency, cracking just enough to make my nerves fray. "Mark," she said, her tone hushed and almost conspiratorial, "you need to get here immediately. Something's going on at your house. 2 men went in not too long ago. This isn't the first time, either. I think it's time you caught them in the act." Her words hit me like a runaway train, leaving my heart racing in my chest. My wife, Amanda, had been distant for months, but I had chalked it up to the usual pressures of life, work stress, busy schedules, and the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. Mrs. Parker's call, though, planted a seed of doubt so sharp it felt like it was cutting into my chest. Without a second thought, I grabbed my keys, jumped into my truck, and tore out of the driveway, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The thought of someone disrespecting my home, our home, made my blood boil. As I turned onto my street, an eerie stillness seemed to cloak the neighborhood. Mrs. Parker was watching from behind her curtains, her eyes sharp and focused. The moment she saw me, she hurried to her door and pulled me inside before I could catch my breath. "Listen to me," she whispered fiercely, her gaze darting toward my house. "Your wife is home," and I saw 2 men go inside. They parked a block away, but I've been keeping an eye on them. It felt like I'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. My stomach churned, and my mind raced as I tried to process her words. 2 men. I repeated numbly, as if saying it out loud might make it less real. She nodded gravely. "This isn't the first time, Mark. I've seen cars like that parked nearby when you're not home. You need to put an end to this." My jaw clenched so tightly it felt like my teeth might crack. Every part of me wanted to storm in, kick the door down, and demand answers. But the rational side of me knew better than to go in blindly. I needed a plan. "Thank you for telling me," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the storm raging inside me. "But if I go in alone, I'm not sure I can keep my cool. I need backup." I pulled out my phone and called my buddy Steve, a former cop. He picked up on the first ring. "I need you at my house right now," I said, keeping my tone low. "Amanda's there, and so are 2 guys. Bring your sidearm. This is serious." Steve didn't waste time with questions. "On my way," he replied before hanging up. While I waited, I moved my truck to block the driveway, making sure no one could leave. The idea of those men walking out of my house with smug expressions only stoked my rage. I reached into the glove box, pulled out my own firearm, checked it was loaded, and tucked it into my waistband. By the time Steve arrived, I was trembling, not from fear, but from adrenaline coursing through me like a flood. Together, we approached the house, our steps quiet against the gravel. I gestured for him to take the side door while I moved toward the front. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and I hesitated just long enough to hear muffled voices. My pulse pounded in my ears. Taking a deep breath, I twisted the knob and stepped inside, my gun drawn. The air felt heavy, almost electric, as I moved through the living room. The plush carpet muffled my steps, but I could hear the sound of laughter. Amanda's voice rang out, light and carefree, followed by the deep rumble of a man's laugh. The sound made my stomach twist in knots. I glanced at Steve, who gave me a firm nod, and we crept deeper into the house. The voices grew louder the closer we got to the dining room. Amanda's laughter echoed again, the kind of carefree, joyous sound I hadn't heard from her in months, and certainly not directed at me. The burning sensation in my throat was almost unbearable. Steve positioned himself by the side door, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. We locked eyes, silently agreeing it was time to act. This was just the beginning, though. I had no idea how much worse things were about to get. With my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst through my chest, I took one last steadying breath and stepped around the corner. And there she was, Amanda, sitting at the head of the dining table, twirling the stem of a wine glass between her fingers like she hadn't a single thing to hide. Across from her sat two men, leaning back in their chairs with the smugness of people who believed they were untouchable. The table was littered with half-eaten plates of food, the scent of garlic and roasted chicken still hanging heavy in the air. "Amanda," I said, sharper than I meant to. The whole room seemed to lock in place. Amanda's head jerked toward me, her eyes widening just enough for me to catch it before she masked the surprise. Her expression shifted fast, too fast, into one of irritation, as if I was the one who had crossed a line by showing up unannounced. "What are you doing here, Mark?" she asked, her voice clipped and dismissive. I repeated the question, my tone climbing in disbelief. "What am I doing here?" My gaze flicked to the two men, both watching me now with lazy, satisfied smirks. Their lack of concern only added fuel to the fire burning inside me. "That's a hell of a thing to ask, considering this is my house." Amanda exhaled dramatically, rolling her eyes as she placed the glass down on the table with an exaggerated sigh. "Oh, don't start. They're just friends." "Friends?" I shot back, the word practically spitting from my mouth. "You mean the kind of friends you sneak in when I'm not home?" Her face twisted slightly, the calm facade cracking around the edges. "You're being ridiculous. Let me guess, Mrs. Parker called you, didn't she? That old hag should mind her own damn business." I took a step forward, jabbing a finger toward her. "Don't you dare make this about her," I snapped, the words echoing off the walls. "I know exactly what's going on. You've been lying to me for months." One of the men, tall, broad, with a thick beard and a cocky attitude to match, pushed his chair back and stood up, brushing his hands over his shirt like he was dusting off crumbs. "Look, man," he said, raising his palms as if he was the reasonable one. "We're not looking for trouble. Maybe you should calm down." His words hit me wrong, so wrong, I could feel my fists curl at my sides. "Calm down?" I growled, stepping toward him. "You don't get to tell me to calm down. You're standing in my house, eating my food, with my wife." The shorter, stockier guy sitting next to him chuckled under his breath, and that sound only stoked the fire higher. Steve must have felt it, too, because he stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "I think it's time you boys left," he said, his hand resting casually on his holstered gun. "Now." Bearded guy hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting toward Amanda like he needed her permission. She crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair with a look of pure annoyance. "Fine," she huffed, waving them off like she was dismissing waitstaff. "Go. I'll handle this." The two men exchanged a glance, then shuffled toward the door, muttering as they passed me. I stood rigid, my jaw clenched so tight I thought it might snap. I didn't move until the front door clicked shut behind them, leaving the house swallowed in silence. Amanda rose slowly, wine glass still in hand. She brought it to her lips, taking a long, deliberate sip before finally breaking the tension. "Well," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm, "you really outdid yourself tonight. Congratulations, Mark. You just humiliated me in front of my friends." I blinked at her, stunned by the sheer audacity. "Embarrassed you?" I echoed, barely able to keep my voice steady. "Are you even hearing yourself? You've been sneaking around behind my back and somehow I'm the problem." She set the glass down with a sharp clink, scoffing as if I were being dramatic. "Oh, grow up. Not everything revolves around you. Maybe if you weren't so predictable and boring, I wouldn't have to find other outlets." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the air right out of my lungs. For a second, I just stood there, unable to believe what I was hearing. This woman standing in front of me, wasn't the Amanda I knew. The Amanda I married was warm, thoughtful, and kind. This version was ice-cold, sharp-edged, and cruel. "You're unbelievable," I muttered, my voice barely holding together. "Do you even care about this marriage? About me?" She rolled her eyes again, as if the very idea of it was absurd. Spare me the pity party, Mark. Let's not pretend. This marriage has been dead for years, and we both know it. Her words landed with a finality I wasn't prepared for, cutting deeper than I thought possible. Every memory, every moment we built together seemed to dissolve right then and there, as if none of it had ever mattered. I felt like the biggest fool alive, blind to the truth that had been staring me down for months, maybe even years. I had clung to this relationship like it was worth saving, while Amanda had clearly let go a long time ago. I loved you, I said, barely able to get the words out. My voice trembled, quiet enough that I wasn't sure she even heard me at first. I gave you everything. She didn't miss a beat. Her lips twisted into that cruel little smile I was beginning to hate. Maybe you shouldn't have, she replied coldly. That's on you. The words felt like a slap I should have seen coming, but somehow it still knocked the air right out of me. I turned away, blinking hard to stop the tears threatening to blur my vision. Steve's hand landed gently on my shoulder, his touch steadying me just enough to pull me back from the edge. Mark, he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. Let's go. This isn't worth it. He was right, God, was he right? This wasn't worth it. Not anymore. I clenched my fists until my nails dug into my palms, trying to focus on the pain, anything to keep from losing control. I glanced back at Amanda, still standing there with that smug look on her face, sipping wine like she had just won some twisted game. Not worth it, I repeated, the words hollow in my mouth. I shook my head slowly. You're right, Steve. She's not worth it. Amanda's smirk deepened, like she had scored the final point in an argument I hadn't even known I was losing. It was the kind of look that told me she thought she'd broken me for good, and maybe she had. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, anger, heartbreak, and something else I couldn't name. My breath hitched, and for a split second, I thought I might break down, yell, cry, maybe both. But then, just as suddenly, a strange calm settled over me, smoothing out the edges of my rage. Give me a minute, I said, my voice quieter than before. Steve hesitated, his hand lingering on my shoulder as he searched my face for any sign I was about to do something reckless. I met his gaze, letting him see I had a grip on myself. For now, at least. He gave a reluctant nod and stepped outside, pulling the door shut softly behind him. When I turned back around, Amanda was sitting on the couch, one leg crossed over the other, swirling her wine like she was waiting for the next round. She didn't even try to hide the amusement in her eyes. Let's hear it, Mark, she said, the sarcasm thick in her voice. What's the big speech? Gonna tell me what a horrible wife I am? How I ruined our perfect little marriage? Go ahead. Get it off your chest. Her arrogance was like gasoline on an open flame. Why? I asked, barely able to keep the tremor out of my voice. Just, why, Amanda? Was it the money? Attention? Did you get bored? She rolled her eyes and took another long sip. Don't act like some victim, Mark. You think you're this amazing husband, but you're not. You're predictable. You go to work, come home, eat dinner, sit in front of the TV, and then you sleep. Every single day. You're like a machine. That's your excuse. I snapped, feeling the heat rise in my face. I worked my ass off to give us a good life. I thought that's what we both wanted, a stable, happy marriage. Well, you thought wrong, she said flatly, setting her glass down on the coffee table with a soft clink. I need passion. Excitement. And you can't give me that. Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat threatening to choke me. So, what now? I asked bitterly. You planning to run off with one of those guys? Or both? Is that the kind of excitement you're after? For the first time, the smirk on her face flickered. Her eyes narrowed, and the corners of her mouth tensed. "Don't you dare judge me," she hissed, the bite in her tone unmistakable. "You have no idea what it's like to feel trapped in a dead marriage." "Trapped?" I let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You could have talked to me, Amanda. We could have tried to fix things. But instead, you snuck around behind my back like a coward." Her expression hardened instantly, and she shot up from the couch, fire in her eyes. "Coward?" she spat. "You're the coward, Mark. You hide behind your job, your routines, and your stupid moral high ground. You can't even admit to yourself that we were never right for each other." The venom in her words stunned me, but what struck me harder was the realization that maybe, just maybe, she meant every damn word. "If you felt this way for so long," I said, barely able to hold back the disbelief, "why didn't you leave? Why not walk away and chase whatever passion you think you're missing?" She shrugged, her tone icy and matter-of-fact. "Because I didn't want to start over. I liked the security. The house. The perks that came with being married to you. But that doesn't mean I was happy." Her honesty landed like a sledgehammer to the gut, knocking the wind out of me. I felt sick, no, worse than sick. I had spent years building something with this woman, believing we were a team. And now, I was just realizing I'd been nothing more than a convenience, a placeholder in her life. "You're unbelievable," I said quietly, shaking my head. "You used me. You took everything I gave you and threw it back in my face." My voice cracked under the weight of the words, each one carrying more hurt than I intended to show. Amanda barely flinched. She just waved me off like I was being ridiculous. "Don't be so dramatic. This happens all the time. People fall out of love. It's life." "It's not life," I shot back, my teeth clenched so tight I could feel the strain in my jaw. "It's betrayal." She rolled her eyes and casually picked up her phone, scrolling like she couldn't be bothered to engage any further. "Are we done here? I've got plans tonight." "Plans?" The disbelief in my voice was undeniable. "You're serious right now? What do you expect me to say, Mark? That I'm sorry? That I regret it?" She looked up from her phone, eyes cold and unmoved. "Well, I don't. Maybe if you'd paid more attention, we wouldn't be here." Her indifference was suffocating. I could feel the anger rising again, burning hot in my chest, threatening to spill over. "You're disgusting," I spat, my hands trembling at my sides. "I don't even recognize you anymore." "Good," she said with that same infuriating smirk. "Maybe now you'll finally let go." I stood there, just staring at her, the woman I had once built my whole world around. I thought about the vacations we took, the nights we spent laughing in front of the TV, the mornings we held each other a little longer than necessary. It all felt distant now, like someone else's memories playing on repeat in my head. Without another word, I turned toward the door. Steve was leaning against his car, arms crossed, watching the house like it might explode. His eyes met mine the second I stepped outside. "Well?" he asked, his voice low. "It's over," I said, though the words barely felt real. "You sure?" I nodded, swallowing hard against the lump threatening to rise in my throat. "Yeah. I'm sure." As we drove away, I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see, just shattered trust and the hollow shell of what used to be my home. The silence in the car felt heavy, pressing in from all sides. Each mile we covered seemed to drive the realization deeper, everything I thought I had was gone. I had been living in a lie, pouring myself into something that never really existed. Steve didn't talk much. He didn't need to. Some things are better left in the quiet. But my thoughts weren't quiet. They screamed. I could still hear Amanda's voice in my head, that cold and careless tone cutting like glass. "Maybe now you'll finally let go." Let go of what? The idea that I ever mattered to her. The belief that the woman I loved wasn't this heartless stranger I barely recognized anymore. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I replayed the scene in my mind, her smirk, the flick of her wrist as she dismissed me. It was like she thrived on the destruction she left behind. "You okay, man?" Steve's voice broke the silence, soft but deliberate. I hesitated, staring straight ahead at the road stretching out in front of us. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "How are you supposed to be okay when the one person you trusted more than anyone, is the one who tore it all apart?" Steve let out a slow breath, leaning his head back against the seat. "First thing, you breathe. You're not going to fix this tonight. Hell, you're not going to fix it at all. Not if she's like that." He paused for a second, letting the words sink in. "People like Amanda don't change. They don't even see that they're the problem." I nodded, though my mind was still tangled up in everything that had happened. Deep down, I knew he was right. Amanda had shown me exactly who she was, and there wasn't a single part of her that cared about what she had done, or who she'd hurt. When we pulled up to Steve's house, a modest ranch-style place just past the edge of town, he handed me a beer the second we walked inside. I collapsed onto the couch, the weight of the night pressing down hard, but the familiarity of being around a friend made it a little easier to breathe. "So," Steve said after a while, watching me carefully. "What now?" I stared at the floor for a moment, turning the question over in my head. "I don't know," I admitted quietly. "I can't go back there. Not tonight." "You can stay here as long as you need," Steve said, his tone calm but firm. "But you've got to start thinking long-term. Are you planning to fight for this marriage, or is this the end of the road?" His question lingered like smoke in the room. Fight for the marriage? I turned the thought over in my head, but it felt like grasping at air. What was left to fight for? Amanda had made her position crystal clear, mocking me, humiliating me, and tossing our life aside like it meant nothing. The idea of trying to rebuild after that made my stomach twist. "She doesn't want to fix this," I said quietly, the truth settling heavily on my chest. "I don't think she ever did." Steve nodded, slow and understanding. "Then don't waste your time chasing someone who's already gone." Morning came too soon, and I woke up on Steve's couch with a dull ache behind my eyes and a weight in my chest that felt impossible to shake. It wasn't just the beer, it was everything Amanda had left in her wake. I scrolled through my phone without purpose, my thumb moving over the screen while my mind wandered. Then I saw it, a message from an unknown number. I opened it out of habit, not expecting much. It was a photo. Amanda. She was with one of the men from last night, the tall one with the thick beard. They were sitting at a bar, drinks in hand, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. The timestamp was brutal, barely an hour after I'd walked out of the house. My blood ran cold. I had no idea who sent it or why, but none of that mattered. The image burned itself into my memory, sharp and cutting, making the betrayal feel brand new. She wasn't even pretending anymore. There was no guilt, no hesitation, just Amanda, living her life like I'd never been a part of it. Steve stepped into the room, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "You good?" I didn't say a word. I just handed him the phone. He glanced at the screen, letting out a low whistle. "Damn," he muttered. "She's not even trying to be subtle." "No," I said, my voice tight and hollow. "She doesn't care. She never did." Steve lowered the phone and met my eyes. "So, what now?" I stood, pacing the room as the image played on a loop in my mind. Part of me wanted to lash out, to drive straight to that bar and make a scene. But what was the point? Amanda didn't feel anything, not guilt, not remorse, not even shame. She was already gone. "I'm done," I said finally, stopping in my tracks. "I'm filing for divorce." Steve gave a slow, approving nod. "It's the right call, man. You don't deserve this." By midday, I was on the phone with anyone who could help untangle my life from Amanda's, lawyers, banks, anyone who could start the process. For the first time in days, I felt like I was taking back some control. But just as I was beginning to breathe again, my phone rang. Mrs. Parker. Mark, she said, her voice trembling on the other end. You need to come home. I froze. What's wrong? I've been keeping an eye on the house, she whispered, urgency leaking through every word. Amanda's there. But, there's someone else with her. It's not one of the men from last night. It's someone new. And they're fighting. Loudly. Fighting? I repeated, already grabbing my keys. Yes, Mark, she insisted, her voice shaking. It doesn't sound good. You need to get over here now. I hung up without another word and bolted for the door. Steve followed, slipping his jacket on and instinctively resting his hand near the holster on his belt. The drive back to the house felt endless. My thoughts raced, chasing worst-case scenarios and unanswered questions. Who was this new guy? Why were they fighting? Mrs. Parker was waiting when we pulled up, standing in her driveway, pale and visibly shaken. She pointed toward my house with a trembling hand. They're in there, she whispered. I didn't wait. There was no hesitation this time, no strategy, no second-guessing. I stormed up the front steps and shoved the door open, letting it slam hard against the wall as I stepped inside. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out everything but the rush of adrenaline. Shouting erupted from upstairs, Amanda's voice, sharp and panicked, followed closely by a deeper, angrier one. Steve was right behind me, his eyes sharp, his hand still on his weapon as we moved through the house. The living room looked untouched, but the noise from upstairs was unmistakable. I didn't speak. I didn't stop. I took the stairs 2 at a time, ready for whatever waited at the top. Careful, Mark, Steve murmured, his voice low and measured. We don't know what's happening up there. But I didn't care. I took the stairs 2 at a time, each step landing hard, echoing through the house like the beat of a war drum. As I neared the top, the voices sharpened, their anger cutting through the air. You're insane. Amanda's scream pierced through the hallway. Get out before I call the police. Go ahead. Call them, the man's voice boomed back. Let's see what they think about the lies you've been telling. The door to our bedroom stood half open, and from the hallway, I could see Amanda near the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her stance was defensive, but there wasn't fear in her eyes, just irritation. The man paced the room, his face twisted in anger. He was tall and wiry, his eyes wild and darting, but the second I stepped through the doorway, they locked onto me. Who the hell are you? He barked, jabbing a finger in my direction like I was the one intruding. I didn't answer right away. My eyes were fixed on Amanda, waiting for her to explain. But she didn't look rattled, if anything, she seemed exasperated by the whole scene. Who is this, Amanda? I asked, my voice low but sharp. Another one of your friends? She rolled her eyes, her hands landing on her hips. Oh, don't start, Mark. This isn't about you. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Not about me. I repeated, my voice rising with disbelief. You've turned our house into some kind of circus, and now there's a stranger screaming in our bedroom. How the hell does this not involve me? The man stepped closer, his shoulders squaring up like he wanted me to know he wasn't afraid. You must be the husband, he sneered, his words dripping with contempt. The clueless idiot she's been stringing along. Steve's voice cut through the tension from the doorway, cold and firm. Watch it. He leaned against the frame, but his hand hovered near his holstered weapon, eyes locked onto the stranger like a predator sizing up prey. The room fell silent for a beat, the tension simmering just beneath the surface. Amanda threw her hands up, exasperated. Oh, for God's sake, can everyone just calm down? She shot a glare at the man. "This is Jake," she said, waving him off like he was nothing. "And he's nobody, all right. He's just being dramatic." "Dramatic?" Jake's laugh was cold, humorless. "Why don't you tell your husband the truth, Amanda? Tell him how you've been playing both of us. Or should I?" My stomach twisted. I didn't know where this was headed, but I could already feel the ground shifting under me. "What the hell is he talking about, Amanda?" I demanded, my heart hammering. She shot Jake a warning glare, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Shut up, Jake. You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I don't." Jake's sneer deepened as he turned to face me fully. "She's been lying to both of us, man. Stringing you along for the house and the security while she's with me for, well, everything else." "Shut up!" Amanda shrieked, lunging toward him. Steve took a step forward, his arm extending just enough to block her path. "Stay back," he warned, his voice flat but dangerous. "I'm not in the mood for this." My heart pounded so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. I turned to Amanda, my hands trembling at my sides. "Is that true?" I asked, barely able to choke the words out. "You've been with him too?" For a split second, Amanda hesitated, just long enough to confirm everything I didn't want to believe. When she finally spoke, there wasn't a trace of regret in her voice. "So what if I have?" she said, her chin jutting out defiantly. "You're not exactly Prince Charming, Mark. God, you're pathetic. Always whining about your feelings, like that somehow makes you special." Her words slammed into me, each one heavier than the last. I felt the blood drain from my face, my vision narrowing until all I could see was her. This woman, the woman I thought I knew, felt like a stranger now, someone cold and vicious. "You're unbelievable," I said, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. "I gave you everything, Amanda. Everything. And this is how you repay me?" She scoffed, throwing her hands up as if I was the one being ridiculous. "Oh, please. Don't act like some kind of saint. You're boring, Mark. You're predictable. I needed more." Jake snorted from the corner of the room. "And I'm guessing you didn't tell him about the money either, did you?" Amanda froze. For just a moment, the mask slipped. Her eyes widened, barely noticeable, but I caught it. Then she forced her expression back into something colder, sharper, as if daring me to ask. "Shut up, Jake," Amanda snapped, her voice sharp and trembling. But the damage was already done. "What money?" I demanded, my voice rising as I turned to her. "What the hell is he talking about?" Jake took a step forward, his expression twisted with disgust. "She's been draining your joint account. Thousands of dollars. Claims it's for bills, but it's not. She's been funneling it into her little escape plan." "Jake, I swear to God, shut up." Amanda's voice cracked as she screamed, but the truth was already out. The room seemed to tilt as the pieces clicked into place. Amanda's sudden insistence on handling our finances, the vague excuses for withdrawals, her erratic shifts in mood, every bit of it made sense now. It felt like the ground beneath me had disappeared. I turned to her, my voice barely more than a whisper. "How could you do this?" Amanda didn't say a word. She just stood there, staring at me with cold indifference. No guilt. No remorse. Nothing but quiet contempt. Jake scoffed, shaking his head as he walked out without another glance, his footsteps heavy as he disappeared down the stairs. Amanda didn't move. She stood there like a statue, arms crossed, daring me to say something else, daring me to react. Steve stepped in closer, lowering his voice. "Mark, let's go." I could barely nod. My body felt disconnected from my mind as I turned and followed Steve out the front door. I didn't look back. The ride to Steve's house was thick with silence. I sat there, hollow, as if something vital had been scooped out and left behind in that house. I kept replaying everything, Amanda's words, her icy stare, the way she didn't even flinch when Jake exposed her. Steve finally broke the silence. "Mark, I don't mean to push you, but you've got to do something. She's not just screwing around, she's stealing from you." "I know," I muttered, staring blankly at the road ahead. "I'll call my lawyer tomorrow." "Tomorrow might be too late," Steve pressed. "You need to freeze those accounts tonight. Every hour you wait, she's pulling more money. Do it now." He was right. I pulled out my phone, logging into the bank app. My breath caught in my throat as I scrolled through the transactions. Jake wasn't lying. Thousands were gone, some in small amounts, others in large, blatant chunks. The most recent withdrawal had been made that afternoon. "She's taken almost 10 grand, I muttered, swallowing hard. "That was supposed to cover the mortgage." Steve clenched his jaw. "That's not just betrayal. That's theft." Without hesitation, I called the bank, canceling every shared credit card, freezing the joint accounts, and shifting whatever remained into an account under my name. Each call felt like cutting another tie, another piece of the life we had built together. By the time it was over, I felt like I had buried something important, something I hadn't even realized was dying. It was late by the time we walked inside. Steve handed me a beer, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. His face was serious, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. "You're doing the right thing," he said, leaning forward. "I know it hurts, but you've got to rip the band-aid off. Let it bleed now, or it'll bleed later." "I know." I stared down at the table, watching the condensation drip down the side of the bottle. How did I not see this coming?" Steve didn't hesitate. "Because you're a good man. You trusted her. She used that." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Morning crept in, pale light seeping through the window. I sat there, drifting between exhaustion and disbelief, until my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. My gut twisted as I opened it. "You think you're clever, cutting off the money? You're pathetic. I'll get what I'm owed one way or another." My hands trembled. I stared at the message, barely able to believe the audacity. What she's owed. After everything, she still saw herself as the victim. "Amanda?" Steve asked, leaning over to look at the screen. "Yeah," I said, handing him the phone without another word. Steve read the message, his face hardening as his eyes narrowed. "She's bluffing," he said, his tone low and certain. "You've already locked her out of the accounts. There's nothing left for her to touch. Unless she goes after something else," I muttered, my mind racing. "The house, the car, hell, even my reputation." Amanda had already shown she was more than willing to burn everything to the ground if it meant she got her way. "Then you've got to cover yourself," Steve replied, his voice firm. "Call your lawyer. Get every word in writing. Document everything she says or does from now on. Don't leave anything to chance." The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, paperwork, and phone calls. By the time evening rolled around, I felt like I'd run a marathon with no finish line in sight. Still, even with all the legal boxes checked, that gnawing feeling wouldn't let go, the sense that Amanda wasn't finished. That feeling was confirmed when my phone rang again. But this time, it wasn't Amanda. It was Mrs. Parker. "Mark," she said, her voice tight and trembling. "You need to come over. Now." I sat up, gripping the phone. "What's wrong?" "It's Amanda," she whispered. "She's been having some kind of meeting at the house. Men coming and going all afternoon." A chill ran down my spine. "What kind of meeting?" "I think she's selling things. Furniture, electronics, whatever she can move. There's a truck in the driveway right now." I felt the breath leave my lungs. "Thanks, Mrs. Parker," I said, my voice taut with barely controlled rage. "I'll handle it." I didn't need to ask Steve if he was coming, he grabbed his jacket without a word. The drive back to the house felt suffocating, my grip on the wheel so tight my knuckles had gone white. "If she's trying to sell my stuff," I said, barely able to keep my voice steady, "I swear to God." "Stay calm," Steve cut in. "We'll stop her. Just don't do anything you can't take back." But the sight that greeted me when we pulled up made calm feel impossible. A moving truck sat in the driveway, half full. Amanda stood outside, barking orders at two guys hauling boxes out of the house. I recognized them instantly: our TV, the coffee table, even the wedding china we'd barely ever used. "What the hell is this?" I shouted as I slammed the car door behind me. Amanda spun around, her eyes narrowing with annoyance rather than surprise. "Oh, great. You're here," she said, crossing her arms as if I had somehow inconvenienced her. "Yeah, I'm here," I snapped, stepping closer. "And you're not taking a damn thing out of this house." "Actually, I am," she fired back, not even flinching. "Half of this is mine, Mark. You don't get to decide what I take." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Half of it? After everything you've done? You've already stolen enough." She rolled her eyes, her hand gesturing toward the movers like she was bored of the entire ordeal. "Spare me the theatrics. You're just pissed because I finally stopped playing housewife." I stepped in closer, barely keeping my composure. "You don't get to act like you're entitled to anything after betraying me." One of the movers, broad-shouldered, covered in tattoos, stepped forward, raising his hands as if to defuse the situation. "Hey, man," he said carefully, "we're just doing our job. If you've got a problem, take it up with her." "Oh, I will," I growled, locking eyes with Amanda. "But you're not taking anything until this gets sorted out." Amanda smirked, pulling her phone from her pocket. "Fine. Let's call the cops. Let them decide what's mine." Her threat hung in the air, throwing me off for just a second. Steve stepped in, his voice low but steady. "Go ahead," he said, tilting his head slightly. "We'll be happy to explain how you've been stealing from the accounts and selling off property that doesn't belong to you." Amanda's confidence flickered, just for a second. She muttered something under her breath and waved the movers off. "Fine. Whatever. This isn't over." The truck pulled away, rumbling down the street and leaving behind a strange, hollow quiet. I stood there, watching the driveway where the truck had been, feeling the weight of everything settle onto my shoulders. "She's not done," I muttered. "No," Steve agreed. "But neither are you." The air felt heavy, and though the house was silent, it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the quiet before a storm, the kind that left you bracing for whatever came next. I clenched my fists, staring at the empty driveway. Whatever Amanda had planned next, I'd be ready. Steve lingered nearby, his presence grounding me like an anchor in a storm. "She's not going to stop, Mark," he said, breaking the silence that had settled over us. "You need to hit back harder. She's testing the limits, seeing how much she can get away with." I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. "I know. She's already taken so much, but if she thinks she can strip me down to nothing and walk away like it's nothing," my voice trailed off, frustration tightening in my chest. "She's underestimating you," Steve replied, his tone calm but firm. "But don't stoop to her level. We outsmart her." This wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't about the furniture or the accounts. It was about reclaiming my dignity, taking back the life Amanda had tried to steal right out from under me. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt something shift. A spark of resolve. That night, I buried myself in paperwork, combing through bank statements, emails, and any scrap of evidence that could give me an advantage. With my lawyer's guidance, I started compiling everything, each withdrawal, every sketchy transfer, every red flag I had brushed aside. The deeper I dug, the uglier the truth became. Payments to strangers, vague notations on receipts, luxury items I'd never laid eyes on, it painted a picture of someone who had been plotting their escape long before the cracks in our marriage were visible. Amanda hadn't just been unfaithful. She had orchestrated her exit with precision, planning every detail. By midnight, my phone buzzed. Another text. From Amanda. You think you're clever? Blocking me from the money won't stop me. Watch your back. I stared at the screen, the words cold and venomous, sending a chill through me. Steve glanced up from his coffee, catching the tension in my face. Another threat? I turned the phone toward him. Yeah. She's getting desperate. Steve's eyes narrowed as he leaned back in his chair. Good. Desperate people screw up. Let her dig her own grave. The next morning, an unexpected knock echoed through Steve's house. When I opened the door, I froze. Jake. The same Jake who had blown Amanda's infidelity wide open stood on the porch, looking worse for wear. His eyes were bloodshot, and he had the haggard look of someone who hadn't slept in days. What the hell do you want? I asked, every muscle tensing. I need to talk to you, he said, his voice rough, almost pleading. It's about Amanda. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to shut the door in his face, but something about the way he stood there, his shoulders slumped, hands stuffed deep in his pockets, made me pause. I stepped aside reluctantly, letting him in. Steve crossed his arms, leaning against the wall, his gaze fixed on Jake like a guard dog waiting for a reason to bite. Jake sat down heavily, rubbing his hands together, the nervous energy rolling off him in waves. Look, I know you've got no reason to trust me, he started, avoiding eye contact. But you need to hear this. I folded my arms, leaning against the counter. I'm listening. Amanda's dangerous, Jake said quietly, the words hanging in the air like smoke. My brow furrowed. Dangerous how? He exhaled, running his fingers through his hair. She's been playing me too. I thought I was the only one until I found out about the other guys. He glanced at Steve, then back at me. When I confronted her, she snapped. Told me I was nothing. Said I was just a tool she used when it was convenient. Then she threatened me, said she'd wreck my life if I crossed her. His words filled the room with an uneasy weight. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to throw him out and let him deal with the mess he helped create. But there was something in his eyes, fear, regret, something real, that kept me still. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, narrowing my eyes. Jake met my gaze for the first time, his expression grim. Because she's unhinged. And I think she's going to come after you harder than you realize. Amanda doesn't just want to leave you, she wants to destroy you. I leaned back against the counter, the weight of his words pressing into my chest. Amanda had already stripped me of so much, but if Jake was right, she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Steve shifted his weight, his arms still crossed. So, what do you suggest? He asked, his tone cold and controlled. Steve's presence was a steady anchor in the chaos swirling around me. She's not going to stop, Mark, he said, finally breaking the silence that hung between us. You have to hit back harder. She's testing you, seeing how much damage she can do. I dragged a hand through my hair, exhaling slowly. I know. She's already taken enough. But if she thinks she can strip me down to nothing and just walk away, my voice trailed off, tightening in frustration. She's underestimating you, Steve replied, his gaze steady. But don't let her pull you down with her. We outsmart her, stay sharp, stay ahead. This wasn't just about the money or furniture anymore. It was about taking back the pieces of my life Amanda had tried to destroy. For the first time since this nightmare began, something shifted inside me. A flicker of determination. That night, I buried myself in paperwork, working long past midnight. I combed through every bank statement, email, and receipt I could find, any scrap of evidence that might give me the upper hand. Under my lawyer's guidance, I began piecing together Amanda's trail of deceit, every withdrawal, every shady transfer, every dollar she siphoned away. The deeper I went, the worse it got. There were payments to names I didn't recognize, vague descriptions that didn't add up, and luxury purchases I'd never laid eyes on. The pattern was clear: Amanda had been preparing to leave long before I ever suspected trouble. She hadn't just betrayed me, she had plotted her escape with precision. I was nothing but a stepping stone in her grand plan. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. A text. From Amanda. "You think you're clever? Blocking me from the money won't stop me. Watch your back." I stared at the screen, the words sending a slow chill through me. Steve glanced up from across the table, his coffee forgotten. "Another threat?" "Yeah," I said, tilting the phone to show him. His eyes darkened. "She's getting desperate." "Good," he added after a pause, leaning back in his chair. "Desperate people screw up. Let her bury herself." The next morning, a knock at Steve's door startled me out of the haze of exhaustion. I opened it, expecting the mail or maybe another legal notice, but instead, I found Jake standing there. The same Jake who had blown Amanda's lies apart. He looked rough, his eyes hollow and bloodshot, like sleep had been a luxury he hadn't seen in days. "What do you want?" I asked, unable to hide the edge in my voice. Jake shifted uncomfortably. "I need to talk to you. It's about Amanda." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to slam the door in his face, but something in his expression stopped me. I stepped aside. "Come in." Steve leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Jake with the wary eyes of someone who wasn't ready to trust but was willing to listen. Jake dropped onto the couch, rubbing his hands together nervously, like he was working up the courage to speak. "Look," he started, "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from. But you need to know something." I folded my arms. "I'm listening." "Amanda's dangerous," he said, his voice low. I frowned. "Dangerous how?" Jake exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. "She's been playing me too. I thought it was just us, but there were others." He swallowed hard. "When I confronted her about it, she lost it. Told me I was nothing but a tool, someone to use when it suited her. Then she started threatening me. Said if I crossed her, she'd destroy my life." His words filled the room with a heavy stillness. I wanted to hate him, God knows I had every reason to, but there was something in his voice that caught me off guard. A flicker of fear. Regret. "Why tell me this now?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. Jake met my gaze, his shoulders slumping. "Because she's off the rails. I think she's coming for you harder than you realize. She doesn't just want to leave, Mark. She wants to wreck you. Burn everything down until there's nothing left." The weight of his words settled in my chest like a stone. Amanda had already torn apart so much, my trust, my home, my sense of security. If Jake was right, she wasn't done. Not even close. Steve shifted, breaking the tense silence. "So," he asked, his tone cold and precise, "what do you suggest we do?" Jake shifted in his seat, running a hand over his face like he was trying to rub away the exhaustion. His eyes flicked between me and Steve, searching for some kind of understanding that wasn't going to come easily. "I don't know exactly," Jake admitted, his voice low. "But you need to be careful. Amanda's not just angry, she's calculated. She's been talking to people, shady types. I think she's looking for leverage, maybe dirt on you. Whatever she can use to make your life hell." Steve's gaze didn't waver. "What kind of people?" Jake hesitated, as if saying it aloud would make it more real. Guys who don't mind bending the law. She's desperate, and I think she's getting reckless. I could feel the weight of Steve's stare as he absorbed Jake's words. His grip tightened on the edge of the table, the muscles in his jaw twitching. Let her bring it, Steve said finally, his voice cold and unwavering. If she crosses a line, we'll be ready. Jake shook his head. That's the thing. Amanda doesn't care about lines. She's already crossed them. I sat back, trying to process it all. My mind raced, each piece of the puzzle coming together into a picture I didn't like. I had seen glimpses of this side of Amanda before, the way she could manipulate situations to her advantage, but I never thought she'd take it this far. I ran a hand over my face, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. So what do I do? Just sit back and wait for her to make the next move? Jake leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. No. You make sure there's nothing for her to find. Cut her off completely. If she's looking for dirt, don't leave any. And if there's something she might twist, get ahead of it. Steve nodded. He's right. You can't afford to leave anything vulnerable. No loose ends, no weak spots. I exhaled sharply, nodding in agreement. All right, I said, more to myself than to them. I'll go through everything, personal accounts, records, even work emails if I have to. Jake's expression softened, but there was something else in his eyes, guilt, maybe regret. Look, Mark, he said quietly. I'm sorry for everything. I didn't know how deep she was in this, and I didn't realize I was just another piece of whatever game she's playing. If I'd known sooner. I raised a hand, cutting him off. Save it. We both got burned. Jake gave a stiff nod, falling silent. Steve stepped closer, breaking the tension. You can crash here if you don't want to go back to your place tonight, he offered, his tone softening slightly. Jake shook his head. Thanks, but I'll figure it out. As Jake stood, I followed him to the door. He paused before stepping outside, glancing back at me. She's not done, Mark. Keep your guard up. I nodded, watching as he disappeared into the night. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence left in his wake felt heavier than it should have. Steve crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. He's scared, Steve said simply. Yeah, I replied, my voice quieter. And now so am I. For the first time in days, I realized this wasn't just about Amanda trying to make my life difficult. It was something else entirely, something darker. Steve's voice cut through my thoughts. Tomorrow, we tighten things up. No more chances for her to get ahead of you. She wants a war. Fine. But we fight smart. I nodded, the spark of resolve returning. Amanda thought she could tear me apart piece by piece. But I wasn't about to make it easy for her.